Today on Brief History, we discuss an English king remembered for his unlikeliness to become such. One who would rise to the occasion, seize control, and take his kingdom to the next level of efficiency and operation. His attention to detail, literacy, and financial understanding, mixed with his business mentality, would lead him to be remembered as one of the great medieval kings of the generation. Join me as we take a brief look at Henry I of England, Beauclerc. Henry was born in the latter months of 1068 in England, but the exact location is not known. He was the youngest of 9 or 10 siblings, including 3 older brothers, Robert, Richard, and William, and 5 or 6 sisters, which included his sister Adela, born in 1067, just before Henry. He was the son of William I of England, known as the Conqueror, and Matilda of Flanders, and he and his sister were the only of 2 of the 9 or 10 children born in the purple, meaning that they were born after their father had conquered England and became king. This becomes an important fact later in Henry's life. Henry's second oldest brother, Richard, died in a hunting accident around 1075, thus making Henry the third surviving son. Henry would become literate, unlike his elder brothers, leading many to believe that his parents had plans for him to join the church. But after his brother Richard's death, plans for Henry shifted in line with his other brothers. Nevertheless, his literacy would play a large part in his future. Henry's father, the Conqueror, was injured by the pommel of his saddle in 1087, which led to a serious illness that would eventually lead to his death. On the Conqueror's deathbed, he was surrounded by a small group of attendants, which included his half-brother Robert of Mortain, his son William, known as Rufus, and Henry. They aided the ailing king and listened to his dying words. His older brother Robert had had multiple falling outs with the Conqueror and was not in attendance. Nevertheless, Robert was forgiven by the Conqueror, who named him his successor to the Duchy of Normandy, and Henry's brother, William Rufus, the Conqueror willed to become the King of England. Henry was given £5,000, which was obviously seen as significantly less than his brother's, but likely compensation for his mother's dower lands, which he had a claim to. With his father and brother, William Rufus, realizing that Rufus must go to England immediately in order to take his place as king, Rufus left his dying father's side, leaving Henry as the only son in attendance when his father died. However, he did abandon his father's body after death, along with the rest of the attendants, in order to get his affairs in order. He was also the only son who attended his father's funeral at the Abbaye aux Hommes in Caen. After his father's death, Henry would watch an incredible scene unfold between his brothers as they fought amongst themselves, and he too would eventually play an integral role. Immediately, Henry's brothers were at odds, with Robert taking the initiative. Their uncle, Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, was imprisoned by their father, but was released per their father's dying wishes under orders of William Rufus, who had already been crowned King of England. Rufus reinstated all of Odo's lands and titles in England in an effort to appease Robert, as Odo was one of Robert's greatest supporters and counselors. This did not have the desired effect, and Odo immediately led a campaign on Robert's behalf to depose William Rufus and install Robert as King of England. Henry initially supported Robert, as it appeared that he would most likely easily defeat Rufus, as a majority of the leading Norman nobles in England supported him. He purchased the Norman territory of Cotentin for £3,000 from Robert, which included Avranches, Coutances, and Mont Saint-Michel. Surprisingly, Rufus appealed to the English, and with the lack of interest on the part of Robert, defeated Robert's allies to cement his position as King of England. After Rufus defeated Robert, Henry traveled to England to request the dower lands of his mother. Rufus, after hearing Henry's request, denied him the lands on the basis that he had done nothing to earn them. After the denial, Henry traveled back to Normandy with Robert of Bellême, the son of one of his brother's strongest leading barons. After disembarking the ship in Normandy, they were arrested and imprisoned by his brother Robert, with Robert fearing that Henry had shifted loyalties to William Rufus and was sent back to spread discontent throughout Normandy. Henry was released after 6 months with no evidence to support such accusations. Eventually, however, Rufus would end up doing exactly what Robert was suspicious of, but not through Henry. Instead, Rufus conspired with a man named Conan Pilatus, who would lead an uprising in the Norman capital of Rouen. This information was leaked to Robert, and he appealed to Henry for assistance, with Henry quickly coming to Robert's defense. Henry played a large part in putting down the uprising for Robert, and in a now famous sequence of events would be remembered for his treatment of Conan after his defeat in Rouen. After taking Conan to the top of the castle and offering a view of the lands, Henry had him thrown off the castle, with Conan falling to his death. Robert did not reward Henry in the slightest for his support. In fact, Henry had developed good connections in Cotentin and believed he had a strong support structure should he need it. Robert, seeing this as a threat, all but removed Henry from Cotentin. Rufus started gaining support in Normandy using his immense wealth against Robert. Eventually, Rufus and Robert came to an agreement. Robert granted Rufus lordship over lands in Normandy, and Rufus reinstated nobles in England who had initially betrayed him. Then they agreed to a pact that they would, together, reacquire any lost lands given by their father and assist each other in defending them. They also named each other as heir should they die without one. Nowhere was Henry mentioned or included. With this, Henry had had enough of his brother's ignorance toward him. He angrily rallied support and seized Mont Saint-Michel. His brothers, now acting together as allies, laid siege, and quickly Henry's support evaporated. Henry was allowed to exile in France and is said to have hit rock bottom during this time, living in poverty. But this time was to be short-lived. The treaty between his brothers eventually fell apart after Robert assisted Rufus by putting down Scottish raids in the north of England, but Rufus refused to assist Robert in retaking the county of Maine, previously owned by their father. Soon they were at war, and William Rufus sent for Henry to reconcile. Henry was given great riches and sent to Normandy to fight on Rufus's behalf. Henry did an exemplary job of this, capturing Domfront from Robert of Bellême, and won over the habitants with promise of and adherence to good and just rule. However, things changed abruptly at this point. Robert decided to take the cross and mortgaged Normandy to Rufus and set out on the First Crusade. William, now lord over Normandy, granted Henry the counties of Coutances and Bayeux as reward for Henry's loyalty and work for Rufus. It is said that Henry became extremely loyal to William Rufus after this. However, events a short time later would bring that loyalty into question. On August 2nd, 1100, Henry and his brother William Rufus went hunting in the New Forest along with a hunting party of other nobles. Soon the party split up, with Henry and William being separated. Accounts of what happened next vary, but it's believed that Walter Tyrrell, a French nobleman, loosed an arrow at a passing stag, missing and striking Rufus in the chest, killing him where he stood. Tyrrell, seeing what he had done, fled the country to France, fearing repercussion. Some, citing Tyrrell's reputation as an expert marksman, have concluded that Henry was involved in a plot to have his brother assassinated in order to seize power. However, hunting was an extremely dangerous pastime in those years, with Henry's brother Richard being killed hunting years earlier. The chances of this being an accident are just as likely as an assassination. However, we will never know the truth of what really happened that day. Henry wasted no time in his attempt to become the next king. Remembering that his brother Robert was returning from crusade and that Henry had supported William Rufus's fight against him, Henry had no intention of becoming Robert's vassal once again. He and the rest of the party abandoned Rufus's body where it laid, and Henry headed to Winchester to seize the royal treasury. There was initially some pushback to Henry's seizure of the treasury, but eventually resistance collapsed and Henry was granted the keys to the treasury. Henry had rubbed elbows with many of the leading barons through his support of Rufus, and although Robert may have technically been the rightful heir to the throne on paper through his pact with Rufus, Henry had the support of the men he interacted with in Rufus's court, and noted the fact that he was the only son, as we touched on before, that was born in the purple. The leading barons supported Henry, and he rode to Westminster Abbey in London, where he was crowned King of England on August 5th, 1100, only 3 days after his brother William Rufus was killed. He set about capitalizing on his brother's misgivings, echoing churchmen and landowners' hatred towards Rufus. He promised to be a just king and to eliminate his brother's policies that subjugated the church and landowners. This was done for the first time in writing and is known as his coronation charter. The charter was spread throughout the shires to announce his coronation and promises of rule, and would be the precursor to future kingly pledges, including the Magna Carta. Henry also married Matilda of Scotland on November 11, 1100, daughter of King Malcolm III of Scotland. She was, through her mother, a direct descendant of the House of Wessex, being the great-granddaughter of Edmund Ironside. The House of Wessex was the ruling family prior to Henry's father's conquest of England. This gave Henry legitimacy, as his children would too be descendants of the House of Wessex as well, merging Old English Guard with New Norman Guard. These two things, both his charter and marriage, were successful in assisting him to gain support throughout all of England for when his brother Robert would inevitably invade. He sent for the Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm, to return, as he was still in exile from Rufus's reign. Henry also sent money to the new pope, Paschal II, who was in desperate need of money at the time, in exchange that Henry be recognized and his customs retained, which basically meant that Henry would remain as the head of the Church of England. When Robert would later lobby the Pope for support due to his pact with Rufus, he would find that there was none, as Henry had already covered his bases with the Pope. Robert landed at Portsmouth on July 20, 1101. Henry met him ready for battle and was said to have paraded through his troops, encouraging them and making himself seen. However, a battle never took place. After discussing compromises through intermediaries, an agreement was reached. Robert would renounce his claim to the English throne and acknowledge Henry as king, and in turn, he would receive £3,000 a year from Henry as compensation. This agreement was seen as significantly more beneficial to Henry than Robert. Henry would then encounter some of the same problems his brother Rufus did in dealing with the church. Anselm, in his exile, had committed himself to the Gregorian reforms, which was an ongoing battle at the time in relation to church and state. One of the main disagreements included the investiture controversy, which argued who had the right to install bishops and churchmen, and who those bishops and churchmen owed their loyalty to. The kings obviously believed that they themselves should be appointing the bishops and churchmen, and that homage should be paid to them, while the churchmen believed that the pope or other churchmen should do the appointing, and that homage should be paid to the pope. Eventually, an agreement would be reached, where Henry agreed to renounce his right to appoint bishops and clerics, and in return, they would be required to do homage to him, not the Pope. He then turned his attention to Normandy, never forgetting that his brother Robert had imprisoned him for 6 months years prior when returning from England. He was all too ready to return the favor. Henry placed spies in the company of Robert of Bellême, along with Robert of Belême's brothers, Arnulf of Montgomery and Robert of Poitevin, all of which had lands in England, but were they themselves more closely tied to Normandy. These spies reported offenses to Henry, and he quickly set off to confront the nobles. He captured their lands, and they were all forced to return to Normandy. He then did the same to William, Count of Mortain, his cousin and son of his uncle Robert of Mortain. Eventually, Henry took the fight to Normandy, continually gaining support on the mainland. He laid siege to William of Mortain's castle, Tonshabray, in southwest Normandy. This would end up being the end of the rivalry between Henry and his older brother Robert, as Robert, along with newly exiled Robert of Bellême, came to the assistance of William of Mortain. In what would become known as the Battle of Tonshabray, Robert was easily routed and captured in less than an hour, with Robert of Bellême failing to commit his troops after he sensed defeat. Henry would end up imprisoning his brother Robert for the rest of his life, initially at Devizes Castle and subsequently Cardiff Castle, with Robert dying in 1134 at the age of 83. Henry would claim that he had the right to Normandy due to his brother's ineptitude to rule, which was widely accepted as Robert did a poor job in the management of the duchy. Robert's son, William Clito, was not harmed and given to the care of Norman barons. However, he would be the future source of discontent within Normandy. Henry had 2 legitimate children, William Adelin and Matilda. He also, astonishingly, had at least 22 illegitimate children, including 9 sons and 13 daughters. Although these illegitimate children were not of royal birth, they were held in high regard both by Henry and his close subjects. Henry was said to have cared for his children and went out of his way to make them comfortable and well off, including his illegitimate ones. Obviously, his two legitimate children held a higher distinction in regards to planning for the future, but nevertheless, all were treated with respect. His legitimate daughter Matilda was married to German Emperor Henry V, and his son to Matilda of Anjou, which would in turn allow him to regain the control of the disputed county of Maine, as Maine was used as her dowry. Henry had an interesting relationship with the French king Louis VI of France, known as the Fat, due to the fact that as Duke of Normandy, he was a vassal of the French king, but as King of England, he was an equal to him as well. Henry would eventually swear fealty to him as Duke of Normandy, but only after securing Maine through his son's betrothal, gaining allies in Brittany by marrying one of his illegitimate daughters to the Count, and making friendly monetary agreements with the new Count of Flanders, Charles the Good. These actions eliminated the French king's allies and all but destroyed his power over Henry in Normandy despite Henry's oath of fealty. A small battle took place in the Vexin, which is a small territory between Normandy and the Kingdom of France, between Henry and Louis, known as the Battle of Bremule. In the battle, Louis, who also had William Clito at his side, was easily defeated and fled the field in an embarrassing way. Peace was eventually reached, with Louis allowing Henry's son William Adelin to swear fealty to Louis's 4-year-old son, thus confirming that Louis recognized William Adelin as the heir to the Norman Duchy. William Clito was, for the time being, forgotten by Louis, and he requested his father be released from prison by Henry, as he wished they could travel to Jerusalem together, never to return. This was ignored by Henry, who gave William money instead. Henry had proved that he would live up to his word and rule Normandy better than his brother did. This, unfortunately, meant that he had to spend quite a bit of time in Normandy, and in his absence, his regent of England and much-loved Queen Matilda died in 1118. Henry was keen to keep his kingdom in order. He paid close attention to his currency, enacting severe punishments for those who defaced it, and took his order of business very seriously. He also started raising what are known today as new men of the time. New men were men of low birth that, had intervention of Henry not taken place, would remain in the lower rungs of society as they were not related or attached to any noble families. These men, however, were trustworthy and ambitious, something Henry valued very much. He would install these new men in positions overseeing processes such as tax collection and would essentially give them strong power over earls and bishops in their respective areas. These men, owing all their success to Henry, became fiercely loyal to him, whereas many noblemen born into positions of power would take their positions for granted and perhaps find their loyalty better suited elsewhere. Henry also established the Court of Exchequer, which, among other things, were responsible for counting the earnings of the shires, which were to be brought in, shuffled around on a checkered cloth, and audited. The system works so well that the term exchequer is still used in British governmental positions to this day, and we still exchange currency through paper checks, which derive its name from the exchequer. Henry's attention to his financial administration led to his nickname, Beauclerc, which roughly translates to good clerk. On November 25, 1120, Henry had accomplished what he had wanted to in Normandy and was ready to get back to England. He boarded a ship at Barfleur and set sail across the Channel, a trip which had been made numerous times. It was, in the minds of those traveling, to be an uneventful but joyous trip, as the king was successful in his aspirations in Normandy, but fate would unfortunately intervene. Henry's son, William Adelin, boarded a second ship known as the White Ship, along with a number of young leading men and women of the realm, which also included 2 of Henry's illegitimate sons and some of Henry's new men. They had been drinking and partying along with the crew of the ship, but they decided that they wanted to catch up with the king's ship that evening. They departed from Barfleur in the dark and started traveling at high speeds. The ship inevitably struck a well-known sailing hazard in the channel, breaking open into the sea. It is alleged that William Adelin initially escaped to safety in a lifeboat, but returned to attempt to save family members, with the boat being capsized by those trying to save themselves. In the end, all but one of the 300 lives on board were lost, including William Adelin and Henry's other children. It was said that Henry, after learning of his children's demise, never smiled again. He had done a great deal to set his son up to easily transition to the throne. Now, with William's death, it was all for naught, and he no longer had a legitimate heir to his kingdom. Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois, initially boarded the ship with others, but decided to disembark before departure due to sickness. He would become an important figure in England after Henry's death. In an attempt to salvage the situation, Henry then remarried to a woman named Adeliza, the daughter of a Norman noble, but was not able to produce another heir. Henry feared that his brother Robert's son, William Clito, would gain support due to his loss of heir, and he started to have nightmares of his peasants, knights, and clergy complaining of high taxation. His worst fears were confirmed when his ally, Charles the Good, Count of Flanders, was assassinated and William Clito was installed as Count of Flanders by Louis the Fat, King of France. Henry then made arrangements for the leading magnates to swear fealty to his only legitimate daughter, Empress Matilda, who was now widowed as her husband, the King of Germany, had died. The barons swore to support Matilda's claim, and Henry also successfully arranged Matilda to be married to the Count of Anjou, Geoffrey. They had a son, which they named Henry after his grandfather. The king was overjoyed at the confirmation of the continuation of his royal line. However, disputes arose between Henry and the new couple in regards to the succession. How would it be administered, and who would be the heir? Would it be Matilda in her own right? Would it be the grandson, Henry, with Matilda and Geoffrey as regent? King Henry remained tight-lipped in regards to the issue due to his mistrust of Geoffrey, whose family, the Angevins, have been longtime rivals to he, his father, and his brothers. Henry was campaigning in Normandy, traveling to his hunting lodge at Lyon-le-Forêt with the intention of enjoying some leisure time hunting. There, it is said he ate a large quantity of lampreys, which are a parasitic jawless fish, against his doctor's orders. He became ill, and his condition worsened over the week. When it was apparent that he would not survive, he had his last rites administered and made preparations for his burial. On December 1st, 1135, Henry died and was taken to Rouen to be embalmed. His entrails were buried at Notre-Dame-du-Pré in Rouen, but the body was transported to England to be buried at Reading Abbey, where he had founded a monastery years prior and requested to be buried. The trip to Reading was delayed for 4 weeks in Rouen, allegedly by bad weather, and the body was in a poor state by the time it reached Reading Abbey. He was buried in a tomb before the high altar. Unfortunately, Henry's tomb was destroyed after the dissolution of the abbey in 1539, and today, the old St. James School sits where the high altar once did. A plaque commemorating Henry's burial is mounted in the ruins of Reading Abbey, near where he was initially laid to rest. Henry's reign should not be understated. From birth, his chances of becoming king were extremely low, and during the reign and disagreements of his brothers, he was continually brushed aside and discounted. But Henry was the son of the conqueror, and the trials and tribulations he encountered throughout his youth and early adulthood would prepare him for what lied ahead. He was molded into a wise, calculated leader and is remembered as a great king for his rule and administration, for his compromises with the church, and for his ability to bring peace and stability to the kingdom with his incredible business savviness and financial understanding. His coronation charter would become a loose foundation from which the birth of our modern rights and law would arise. He, like any king, must also be looked at critically. Some believe him to be a usurper, involved in the murder of his brother, and others may criticize his handling of the succession crisis, which may have played a role in the anarchy that followed. Nevertheless, his role in the history of the world will forever be remembered, both now and for generations to come.